I think disabled people not only need to be included in climate and emergency conversations because we're more affected, but because we often have more to contribute. Disabled people are so creative. We're so used to navigating barriers, navigating environments that are hostile to us. And what does that sound like? That sounds like climate change, where our planet is increasingly becoming more hostile to us, where we need to make creative policies and adaptations and mitigations to be able to live on this planet.
Welcome to The Wheelchair Activist, a podcast hosted by me, Emma Vogelman, and every month I interview amazing members and allies of the disabled community who are quite literally changing the world. Well, Anna, thank you so much for joining us on the Wheelchair Activist podcast. I say this to a few of our guests, but I feel particularly for you that people probably know you by name or by reputation. But could you please give our lovely listeners a little bit about you and what you do?
Yeah, thank you, Emma. Thank you for having me. So my name is Anna Landre. I'm a wheelchair user. I'm an activist and a researcher. And I often say that my work centers around what I call the implementation gap of disability law. So that's the fact that in a lot of contexts, we have really great laws that say disabled people shall not be discriminated against, things shall be accessible, but that doesn't really trickle down into reality. So you have this gap in implementation. And I'm really interested in researching that and seeing what we can do to fix that. And one of the areas where I think that's really stark is what we're going to talk about today, which is in emergencies and in climate change with respect to how disabled people are affected by those two issues.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know that had a term, but that makes so much sense
Well, I made
because
it up. It didn't really have a term to
yeah,
my knowledge, but now it does, and
it
anyone else
does.
can steal that.
It does now, everyone. But I think it's so interesting because, like you said, we know that there are these laws in place. You know, in the UK, we have the Equality Act. And so when people hear about instances of discrimination, they go, well, isn't that illegal? Well, yeah, it is. But unfortunately, it does still happen. And I think it's that disconnect for people that doesn't always come through to the lived experience of real disabled people.
Yeah, isn't that the eternal thing? You share an incident of discrimination or inaccessibility, and there's this, well, they can't do that. That's
Yeah.
illegal. And you say, oh, well, maybe you should go let them know. And they go, you should complain. And you're like, yeah, I'll get right on that. I'll go store to
Mm,
store, door to door of every inaccessible restaurant in my town and just every single one, I'll do that. I'll fix it. And it is just unrealistic. It's a systemic issue that needs more than disabled people just complaining or taking one-off measures. We need to look at it systemically.
yeah, I mean, there's, even within that, there's this assumption that as disabled people, we have all the time in the world to make complaints and to chase them up when we don't get responses and all of that. And, there's a million and one things I'm sure we could both say. But like you said, we are here to talk about an issue that we haven't really come across on this podcast before, but it's a particular interest of mine, which is climate change and disaster planning. That sounds like I have a really grim point of interest, but I promise that climate justice and the way that disabled people can be involved in that or excluded from that is a really important factor for me. So, can we start by how are disabled people disproportionately affected by the climate crisis? And that could be in daily life and then also maybe during major environmental disasters, thinking specifically, but not just limited to, the wildfires that there were somewhat recently in California.
I think what normally comes to mind when thinking about the impacts of climate change on disabled people is that famous statistic, which is that disabled people are 2 to 4 times more likely to die or be critically injured in the event of a climate-driven disaster. That is a often repeated stat in this space. And it's true. And as we get into the conversation a bit later, I think we'll talk about the particular reasons for that. But I think perhaps even more important is to talk about this everyday slow violence that environmental injustice causes for disabled and non-disabled people, because pollution and environmental issues are an increasingly common cause of disability. Pollutants, carcinogens, and more mean that I think it was Julia Watts Belzer said something along the lines of human health is increasingly in peril because of our environment and the harms we're doing to it. And that happens in both really dramatic, fast-paced ways, such as a worsening array of floods because climate change is making disasters more intense and more frequent. But it's also done in really slow, imperceptible ways every single day on our bodies. And that's the bodies of non-disabled people that are then being rendered disabled, and on disabled people who are having their conditions worsened or having them change or adding conditions. And likewise, there are also some really interesting factors, like the fact that high temperatures mean that people on certain medications for psychosocial disabilities, like schizophrenia, like depression sometimes, are 3 times more likely to die from heat exhaustion. So are older people. People with spinal cord injuries are more affected by higher temperatures, and people whose disabilities impact cognition and in a heat wave are going to struggle even more. So in addition to the fact that, for instance, you or I, as a wheelchair user, might have more trouble evacuating or fleeing something really fast-paced or impactful like a mudslide, there are these everyday changes that we need to be looking at, and factors that make disabled people more affected.
Those are incredibly stark but incredibly important statistics. And at the time that we're recording this in early May, but in the UK, we just recently had a few days where it was much warmer than it is usually. And I myself am on one of those medications that can cause more heat exhaustion or more impacts of the heat. And it is really profound when you think about how many disabled people are, like you say, impacted on that day-to-day level. So it's incredibly important. Getting into what you said about evacuation, I'd love to know about when disasters strike, whether that be a flood, a mudslide, or whatever it may be, what typically goes wrong when it comes to disabled people.
Yeah. So I often think about the response and the things that disabled people need in 3 key stages. So one, how are you going to be able to safely shelter in place for as long as you can? Because most times your own home is going to be the safest, most comfortable place to be. So to be there as long as possible, especially given accessibility needs. And then when that changes, when you do need to leave, what difficulties are there in the second stage, evacuation? And then finally, after evacuation, you also need to look at sheltering, or in some cases, resettling. And I often find that even when people working in emergency preparedness and response are thinking about disability, they're not thinking about all 3 of these stages. There are quite a lot of gaps. And as for what goes wrong, I think what I'll do is just read a few examples of calls to the Disability and Disaster Hotline that we have at the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies. And all of these calls were in particular for what you mentioned, the California wildfires recently. So in talking about evacuation, there was a couple in Santa Monica who requested help with accessible evacuation because one of them has progressive MS. He uses a Hoyer lift and a hospital bed at home, and was concerned about the availability of these items in shelters, and they usually aren't available. And what happened was our hotline operator was able to work with the Center for Independent Living Network, and the City of LA Emergency Operations Center and the LA Fire Department to make a plan and get these needs sorted. But it's really interesting that it took 3 different factors to sort what frankly are fairly standard disability needs, a Hoyer lift and a hospital bed. Now let's look at another one. There were quite a few callers requesting N95 masks, especially outside of the immediate fire zones where they were able to shelter in place, but the smoke inhalation was a real issue, especially for disabled people with respiratory conditions. And so we were able to assist with the delivery of masks to those people. But it's interesting that that wasn't something that was available, particularly that such a thing is going to affect both non-disabled and disabled people. I'll give one last example, which is on temporary and transitional housing. And this was a big issue in California, which frankly, you might expect to be one of the best case scenarios. A place with relatively new construction compared to most of the world, a really high income context, and what you would expect to be one of the higher awareness contexts in terms of disability. But a lot of people who lost their properties, who lost their homes in the shelter, are left in kind of a state of limbo in terms of getting to a new place, especially with delays in FEMA assistance and grant making, and offers of discounted or free hotel rooms or Airbnbs are often not accessible, in addition to being really high in demand. So a lot of people who were calling to the hotline found themselves temporarily unhoused and in this limbo situation, and we're still trying to help some of them as well. So that is a big one.
What really strikes me about that first example that you gave was that, like you said, those are not unusual access needs. But in addition to having the three actors, like you said, working on this, I'm thinking that's only for one person.
Yeah,
If you think about the community, the huge population that was impacted by those fires and the communities that are impacted by every sort of natural disaster or disaster brought on by climate change, it really isn't an isolated incident. When we say, between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 people have a disability of some sort, it's mind-boggling that after, okay, maybe a first incident like that, you realize you were unprepared. And then what could you do going forward that has mass uptake or that has mass application rather than, okay, let's just sort out this one and, then have to go back to the drawing board for every other disabled person that needs either very different or very similar help.
it's just incredible waste of time, waste of personnel, waste of bureaucratic resources to treat these as niche needs, as one-off needs, when the research shows that they are so common. It's this constant, you know, non-disabled cultural assumption and refusal to see disability as frankly really common. And you mentioned the 1 in 4 stat, 1 in 4 people have some sort of disability. I think we should even be going further because it affects everyone in the household of a disabled person. So that is far
Mm,
more than 1 in 4. You're not going to find in California these families abandoning a disabled family member to all go stay in a shelter. No, that's now a family of 5, maybe, that can't access a shelter and is homeless and is seeking greater assistance and is going to cost the system more resources because their needs are not treated as valid, as on the menu of things that are available. There's also a stat that I really like. It's for the UK that people who identify as quote unquote minorities, or what we call sometimes minoritized or marginalized people, are actually the majority. So we're making these policies that view everyone who is not essentially a single, white, non-disabled, on and on and on man as kind of the standard when really 70.5% of the population are either disabled or queer or people of color or women. And that is removing the double counts of those identities. So thinking about these groups as minorities is doing no one any favors.
I mean, that's fascinating, but as you're saying it, I'm both surprised and not surprised at the same time because it makes so much sense. Not only what you said about how people can be in one or multiple or all of those groups that you just mentioned, but that most of us are in multiple groups. And just thinking about the sheer number of people that that covers makes complete sense that it is so incredibly high. But you're absolutely right. When we're thinking about the normal or the average person, it isn't any of those characteristics. And what I'm thinking as well in those other examples that you gave, particularly about the ones with masks, I'm thinking about how many people with asthma or things like emphysema, COPD, the list goes on of respiratory conditions. But the amount of people who would have those conditions and not identify as disabled. So it's an even greater number of people who are impacted. And I think I'll just say the obvious as well. Like, why the hell would the best masks not be the priority or an obvious go-to in wildfire territory is beyond me, especially when you think about the group of people that that would benefit. And to, again, treat it as a one-off, oh, let's get some to this individual, as opposed to let's get these available to the wider community is kind of astounding.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where, these things for many people, even those who aren't disabled, are going to be a preventative measure to prevent you from developing either a temporary or permanent lung condition during these wildfires that's going to perhaps send you to the emergency room just once or result in an ongoing disability over time and is going to be incredibly resource intensive for you and the system. And that's not to say that disabled people should be concerned with being a quote unquote burden on the system. That's wrong. But we should all be looking to where we can preserve resources for the most marginalized people and prevent harm. And I think our emergency preparedness system, what it does right now, is designed for this imagined, what is called in spatial justice, universal man, which is this person who, again, he doesn't exist, but he is this white man of average ideal height. He's very strong. He never has any children. He's never carrying groceries such that he has trouble opening the front door or a heavy door, and so on and so forth. And this is the way we're designing space for this person who doesn't
Mm,
really exist. And it's also the way we're often designing emergency preparedness policy, such that we're making it a self-fulfilling prophecy that people are going to be harmed, that people are going to struggle to survive, and in some cases not survive, because we're not writing their survival into policy, into planning.
but that brings me to what I wanted to ask you is, you've given those amazing examples that I think illustrate the point really well, but are there any examples that you can think of, whether that's in policy or particular countries, particular governments, that really show how dangerous the situation is for disabled people?
I think there are unfortunately very many, examples of really urgent danger that has, in many cases, resulted in disabled people losing their lives. The most famous one that those of us who work in this sector are familiar with is probably that of Benilde Caixeta in Hurricane Katrina. And Benilde was a disabled woman. She was a wheelchair user who lived in the area of the hurricane, of the flood zone. And the water was coming in, and the buses that came in beforehand to evacuate people were not wheelchair accessible. She was told to call paratransit, which, for those who don't know, paratransit is an American government service of vans that typically come to bring disabled people to medical appointments. And they're notoriously unreliable, notoriously late, notoriously difficult to get a hold of. And she was told, well, you call paratransit and they're going to be the ones who will come and evacuate you. And she called them many times and they never came. And she drowned. And what we really have to ask ourselves as a society is, did this happen because Benilde was disabled? Or did this happen because of a failure of services, of accessibility, of accessible emergency planning? And I think the answer is really, really clear that it's the latter, that this was completely avoidable.
I mean, that is so emotive. I mean, I'm obviously feeling so much empathy and sympathy for, not just for her, but for her family. And like you said, it was completely avoidable. And I think it's, to the people on the other side of that question who are saying, is it because she's disabled? It's, well, from what you described, she did what she was supposed to do. It's not a case where someone maybe failed to self advocate, even though I think there's a lot to unpack, even in just that. But, when we do adhere to the systems that are in place and we try and rely on them, somehow we're still wrong. We're the problem rather than, like you said, the system.
And these are things that happen every day, right? You and I live in the UK, and I don't know how often you take trains in this country, but very often someone does not bring the ramp for me to get off the train. And I am either overcarried, so taken to a city far, far away, the next stop on the train, or I have to make a huge deal and block the doors and pull the alarm and make an absolute spectacle of myself in order to get off the train. And every time we complain about this, if we express distrust in the system, if we even say, I know a lot of disabled people who say, I'm terrified of taking the train. What for others is an
Mm.
everyday occurrence. What for others, they would look at you and say, oh, what do you mean afraid of taking the train? That's why are you being over dramatic? Why are you being such an issue? It's just a train. And we're told that we're irrational almost for refusing to trust systems that consistently fail us. And in the event of an emergency, those failing systems, rather than being inconvenient, rather than me missing a meeting or having my day ruined because I'm overcarried, they become deadly in an emergency. And that's why these systems and accessibility, even on a daily basis, are so important to fix because it's not just getting to an appointment on time through your paratransit or on a train. It's when things go wrong, being able to get out.
I mean, I could talk about problems with trains so much working in transport and then myself who commuted for several years. And it's the point that I, in policy, and I'm sure you do this as well, really try to show people the frequency of
Yeah.
these problems. These are not one-off incidents that are reflected in the media, because I think the media can do a good job of highlighting some of the instances that happen to disabled people. I do think it is largely, of course, on the vocal disabled people or the
Hmm.
disabled people with platforms that we've built up over time. Thinking particularly during the Paris Olympics and before Baroness Tanny Gray Thompson,
Oh, yes.
who's been on this podcast. So go listen to that episode if you haven't. But I also admire Tanny hugely and work with her quite often. And she was left on a train and no one was there to assist her. And it turned into a national news story, which I'm thrilled about. But it doesn't become a national news story necessarily when it's you or me as wheelchair users. We may get a little bit more attention because we're activists in this space. And for a while, a particular train company was certainly afraid of me, and they had every right to be. But it's what we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation, that it relies on us to make complaints to get that visibility. But like you said, it doesn't fix things. So what is always the point in making these complaints? And I think it could be said that in the situation of emergency services during disasters, there isn't that complaint hotline that you can wait 2 to 3 weeks to,
Right.
hear back about. It's something that is life or death right now. And it's appalling to hear instances where disabled people are just completely ignored forgotten. Forgotten implies that, there wasn't that voice in your ear at some point in the process that was saying, hey, what about disabled people? And I say that because you and I are those voices in a lot of spaces, so I know that they exist. But it's so upsetting to hear instances where people are being failed, even when they're adhering to these structures. I'm interested because, like you said, LA, you have these assumptions about it that it's very new, it's very modern. And I think you and I, as both Americans who now live in the UK, we know that the older the architecture, sometimes the more inaccessible a place is. But I'm thinking about a place like LA with the fires, where you would have this assumption that the majority of spaces, particularly thinking of hotels or potentially Airbnbs, that should be accessible. But if we're thinking then about the role of infrastructure, what role do you think that plays in making sure that disabled people can evacuate or, I mean, honestly, just survive in a crisis?
Inaccessible infrastructure, yeah, is a huge barrier because we know as disabled people that whether we're a wheelchair user, whether we're blind, whether we have a psychosocial disability, built space is often really, really exclusionary. And as we just mentioned, in the event of a disaster, that exclusion can be deadly. And in most places in the world, even in the US, which is a relatively new country, which has relatively new buildings and streets and so on, compared to the rest of the world, if we're looking at the US, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, only was passed in 1990. So we're only looking at buildings built since 1990 that decided to comply with the ADA because we know that the ADA is not enforced. It's very similar to the Equality Act here in the UK, where, there are quite a lot of places that comply, either new builds or places that did a big renovation and retrofitted or just decided that this was part of their ethos and they were going to make changes. But a lot of places just build with no regard for it. And there's no ADA police or Equality Act police going around and taking out their measuring tapes and saying, no, this isn't accessible, and then fining or somehow prosecuting these people who haven't complied with the law. It is essentially on a voluntary basis, unless disabled people like you and I go around suing them. And that's something that most disabled people do not have the desire to do because it's really frowned upon by non-disabled people, don't have the resources to do because oftentimes it costs money, and don't have the time to do because we're trying to live our lives in spite of these barriers and surrounding us with even more and getting into what can become really hostile legal battles are not on many people's desired to-do lists. So it's a huge barrier. We're seeing, at least in the US, FEMA, which is the Emergency Response Agency, take a bit more action on this, but it's far from solved in terms of inaccessible infrastructure.
And then thinking about the role that governments play in this. So, the US and the UK thinking particularly, what do you think are the assumptions that they might be working off of when it comes to disabled people in emergency planning? Is the assumption that we don't matter? Is the assumption that we will sort ourselves out? Or, what do you think those assumptions are? And then how do you feel that they're being reflected in policy?
Well, Julia Watts-Belzer has a really good line in one of her articles for Truth Out, which is that disabled people are often implicitly, I don't think it's on purpose, but I do think it is implicit in a lot of government and emergency policy that disabled people are just expected losses in a disaster, that were just acceptable, expected losses. Those people just aren't going to make it. And that's sad, but let's focus our resources on the people we can save. and frankly, the people we value more. Because it's not just an issue of resources if you look at it. There is an argument that we should be approaching disaster planning with utilitarianism as our kind of ethical framework, which is do the most good for the greatest number of people, which often means, okay, well, the people who take more resources to quote unquote save, we're not going to try and save them. We're going to try and save the people who take the least resources to save, which in the society we've built ends up being non-disabled people, often well-resourced, non-disabled people, et cetera, et cetera. But that doesn't quite even hold true for what people are doing because, for instance, in many of our emergency plans, children are put at the forefront. How can you support children in an emergency? Now, children take more resources to support in an emergency, but we're okay with that because we value children, unlike disabled people who in society are not really valued. And you see this also in the humanitarian sphere. There are whole organizations dedicated to helping exclusively children in humanitarian emergencies. And no one questions that. No one says, well, I don't know, maybe we should be looking at how children are harder to save and spend our money on adults. They're cheaper. No, that would be awful. So why do we have that argument for disabled people? Now, these aren't arguments that people will often make outwardly, but when you read the documents, when you see the rhetoric being used, it is implicit. I also think in terms of assumptions that people make, there's this often inability to conceptualize disability beyond a wheelchair user. And at that, a passive, cared for wheelchair user who has no preferences or agency or life beyond that of being a person in a wheelchair. And that's a barrier that we often come up against when talking about disability inclusive emergency preparedness, because we're not just talking about wheelchair users. The disability community is huge and is extremely diverse, but oftentimes people can't quite imagine that. And so there's a lot of training and expansion of that understanding that needs to be done.
I mean, there's so much in that I think we could spend ages talking about. But your point on the utilitarian argument, I think that's probably one I could imagine most people taking. I know that we're not talking about the pandemic specifically, but when we looked at how hospital beds were
Yeah.
prioritized and ventilators were prioritized for particular people, it's not difficult to imagine that coming into disaster planning, or how are we going to relocate this entire community. It makes me very angry, of course, as a disabled person, that is this assumption. And I think it goes into so many spheres of life as a disabled person. Look at employment, for example. There's possibly an assumption that we're going to take more resource, or we're going to produce less than a non-disabled employee. And we know that those things aren't true, but yeah, you're absolutely right about the way that we as a society value different groups of people. But then going back to your point that you made earlier about all of those groups of people eventually become the majority of people if you look at enough of those groups. It's just so profound.
And this focus on value, on productivity, on money, this marketization of the humanitarian sphere, of the emergency sphere, however you want to look at it is eugenics. It is a eugenicist tendency. And you mentioned the pandemic, which was an emergency, however you look at it. And that is how a lot of people in the disability sphere, I think, became aware of this fact that we are less valued, that we are not planned for, our survival is not planned for, and is in fact actively discouraged, like with the fact that here in the UK, many people with learning disabilities and difficulties were given DNR orders, do not resuscitate orders, without their consent, without their knowledge, even. It's how I came into this sector because I was a university student during the pandemic. We were all sent home from university for our safety, and I was sitting in my family home in New Jersey with my ventilator that I own for emergencies. And it was the policy in my state that if I went to the hospital with COVID, with my ventilator that I own, they could have taken it away from me and given it to a non-disabled person because of their calculation that that would be a better use of resources. And that radicalized me, frankly, and made me want to come to work in this sphere. And that's when I contacted the organization I mentioned, the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies, and began working with them.
I don't often swear on this show, but that is fucking ridiculous. That, as you say, something that you own, it would be obviously ventilators are much more valuable than cars, but can you imagine a scenario where they say you arrive at the hospital with your car? If a doctor needs it or if someone else needs it, we're going to take your keys off you and give your car to someone else. Like that would just never happen. And I'm so angry that that happened and that that was the policy, but I'm glad that it's brought another disabled voice into the arena because I suppose my next question is, you mentioned that you got involved in this organization, but I'm thinking, how can disabled people influence policy in this space? So, whether you want to approach that from a US, UK, or just generally, how can people listen to this who are quite rightly worried about what the plans for maybe their local area is? What would you encourage them to do?
I'd really encourage them to maybe first take a look at the work that the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies does, because we're a disability-led, entirely disability-run and staffed organization that works to center disabled people's needs before, during, and after disasters. And I think there are a lot of pieces of writing and reports and records of our activities on the website that could really inspire people to do similar things in their own contexts. Likewise, there are sometimes volunteering opportunities, so you could kind of get in touch and see what's available. But it really is important. I'd encourage disabled people themselves to really think about whether this is a sector you're interested in, because disabled voices are really important. There's other really cool work that I'll give as some examples. Doug Pauly is a really well-known disability campaigner. You probably know him, Emma, who recently challenged the government in a high court case last summer for failing to co-produce its policy on climate change with disabled people and with DPOs, or disabled people's organizations. And that was a really high-profile case that brought this to the forefront of a lot of people's minds, and probably to the mind of government, who hopefully now won't make the same mistakes. Friends of the Earth is a really cool organization that's working to create a disability inclusive network of climate activists, especially of people with learning disabilities and difficulties, which is a community that's, I think, consistently left out, or whose input isn't taken into account in this sector in particular. And then Inclusion London has been doing some really good work on personal emergency evacuation plans, particularly in residential settings and in the wake of Grenfell. And so there's really a lot of different ways that disabled people can get involved in climate action. And then those who maybe aren't disabled but want to support disability justice in climate spaces, there's a few different suggestions, but one is to think about how you can co-produce. And co-production is not consultation. I will rant about this forever and ever. It doesn't mean just kind of having one meeting with disabled people and then saying, oh, well, we co-produced, we took their insights into account, but truly sharing power. Co-production is sharing power. It's not consultation. It's not tokenism. And that's with disabled people and organizations of many different types. particularly of, like we said, those left out of the conversation often. People with learning disabilities, people who are institutionalized, who are at especially high risk of death or injury in an emergency, and those with intersecting identities that are also marginalized. And thinking about all the different ways that these people can add to the conversation. Because I think disabled people not only need to be included in climate and emergency conversations because we're more affected, but because we often have more to contribute. Disabled people are so creative. We're so used to navigating barriers, navigating environments that are hostile to us. And what does that sound like? That sounds like climate change, where our planet is increasingly becoming more hostile to us, where we need to make creative policies and adaptations and mitigations to be able to live on this planet. And so it's simply a no-brainer to include disabled people in this problem that we all have to solve.
Yeah, I mean, I'm forever saying that disabled people are the best creative problem solvers because we have to do that so many times a day, whether that's just how we use our mobile phones all the way through to, you know, planning assistance, whatever it might
Right.
be. So absolutely, I will also forever say that co-production is absolutely essential to any policy because if you don't co-produce, then exactly what we've been talking about. You leave out groups of people who will then be disproportionately impacted just because they weren't thought about. So I'm curious, what would you say? And I'm aware that this is like a big question, but what would an inclusive disaster policy look like to you? What do you think it would look like if disabled people like yourself and others were involved?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think with the caveat that it depends on the emergency, every emergency requires a really different approach across what time it's happening, in what space, emergency of what type. But there's this quote from Sins Invalid that I really like that others have connected to the emergency response space before, and I think is really apt, which is all bodies are unique and essential. All bodies have strengths and needs that must be met. We are powerful, not despite the complexities of our bodies, but because of them. All bodies are confined by ability, race, gender, sexuality, class, nation state, religion, and more, and we cannot separate them. And I think starting from that point of disability justice, that very strong ethos and principles that disability justice has, is a really excellent place to start in terms of planning for emergencies because it takes into account the wide variety, the natural diversity of humanity and starts from there rather than starting from a point of trying to construct in a test tube this average human who is going to stay that way forever, who is going to never need assistance, never be carrying something heavy, such that they, are having trouble getting up the stairs and so on and so forth. But starting from a place of grounded reality and humanity is what we need to be doing. And you see some places starting to do that, but we have a long way to go.
What places are you seeing that might be better practice examples?
So in terms of countries, Bangladesh is doing some really interesting things, I mean, across the board, frankly, on disability. There's a really vibrant community there, but in particular on emergency preparedness and response. Many areas of the country have really significant floods, and there has been work to understand the needs of disabled people in those floods and include disabled people's organizations in that planning of things like boats that are more accessible to be able to evacuate people and so on. They're definitely a real leader in this space.
I mean, that's so interesting. And I think to anyone who might have pause before you answered, I don't think would have guessed Bangladesh as the country that would be leading that. I think people would have this assumption that it's probably the US or the UK or another European nation that's probably doing more for disability apparently on the day to day. I say apparently because there's a lot to unpack in terms of what those countries are doing to disabled people right now. But I think it's really important to be learning from other nations in terms of what is going well, how they're doing the work, even if the types of disasters or the climate or whatever it might be very, very different.
Right. And it's not to say that Bangladesh is the only leader in this space, but that's just one example. And I think it goes to show that this isn't necessarily an issue of resources. I think that is often an excuse, whether you're in a high or low income context. Oh, well, we just don't have the budget for that. And that's patently untrue. Bangladesh is not the most well-off income-wise government in the world. And yet they've made this a priority. They've decided that they're going to do it. And so this issue of, oh, well, if we had all the money in the world, we would love to make sure that you're not going to die in the next flood is not an appropriate response. We can see that plenty of places who are not as rich as the US, not as rich as the UK, are working on this and making significant progress.
Yeah, like you said, it goes back to what is prioritized and what is valued. And, like you said really powerfully, it's that what we as disabled people get reinforced all the time in so many different ways is that we don't have value or we have significantly less value than a non-disabled person or that fictional white man. And just the thing that really tickled me about your description was he can't ever possibly be holding groceries. Just that's such a good visual for something that does cause a temporary difficulty in doing things. But
Yeah.
if this man is never allowed to hold groceries, good luck to him,
Well, we
is what.
often talk about access needs not as something unique to disabled people. They can be permanent. You can have a permanent disability. They can be temporary. Maybe you have an arm injury, maybe you have a cataract, so on and so forth. But they can also be situational. You might be a new parent who's carrying their baby. You might be carrying your two babies. So now you don't have any arm function at all. You might be looking at your phone because you're trying to use the map, and so you're a bit distracted. You might be in a space that's really loud, so you can't hear anything. You might be someone who has a heavy accent in whatever context you're currently in and speaking in that language. And these are all things that turn into being disabling in a particular context. And so if we were building more accessibly, whether that's in an emergency context or otherwise, it's better for everybody.
It goes back to the social model in practice, doesn't it? And if you put barriers in place for people, whatever that might be, they, like you say, are temporarily disabled from doing that task. And I think people really struggle with that because they can't separate temporarily disabled from doing a task to, like you said, this idea that a disabled person is a person in a wheelchair. And while you were doing that description of a disabled person, all the way up until you said passive, I was thinking, yep, well, that's me and Anna. But then when you got to passive, I thought, nope, you've lost us.
Yep.
But I think it's devastating to hear some of the examples of people who have been let down by climate policy and, without sugarcoating it, have lost their lives to that oversight and that lack of engagement with disabled people. So I think, as angry as I still am for you to have had that experience during the pandemic, I am glad that the silver lining is that another voice has been added to this arena where we are trying to work with power holders to change the way that not just that they view disabled people, but what they might view in terms of what disabled people or any person at some point may or may not need. So I think when it comes to emergency planning, I'm hoping more disabled people will want to explore and to potentially get more politically involved with and involved in some of those organizations that you mentioned. We will have as many of them linked in the description of this episode as possible. But what I'm trying to say is I'm glad that this happened to you because it meant that you're adding to this fight, which is incredibly important.
I am too. And, this is really meaningful work. I feel really lucky to do it. And without having those early experiences myself, I wouldn't have gone on to be able to do things like support Fight for Right, a Ukrainian disabled people's organization, in spearheading the first ever wartime evacuation mechanism for disabled people, which we did for disabled people in the war and suffering those effects. And that's been one of the biggest honors of my life. And is going to be a model for future situations, we really hope. So it's turned into something that is getting more attention, is becoming more of a worldwide movement, and is really important for us all to think about both on this grand scale, but also in our own lives. Think about what emergencies are most likely to happen where you live. Is it a tornado? Is it a heat wave? And what can you do to prepare for that? Can you create a go bag that has, a couple doses of the medication you need and some of the equipment you need, your most important documents that you can just take and go? Can you have an extra battery charged for your ventilator? And so on and so forth, to keep us all safe.
And while I hate that that's yet another thing that gets added to the to-do list of disabled people, I think non-disabled people can also take a point from that
It's
because
true.
there will be passports, birth certificates, whatever it might be, or, essential other items that you should have prepared. So I think it's great advice. And I really hope that disabled people and non-disabled people listening to this will consider doing that. And like I said, consider getting involved in some of the organizations that you mentioned because it applies to us all and it's going to apply to us all at the same time. This is the one thing that I suppose doesn't discriminate in the sense that it does impact all of us, but we do know that disabled people are disproportionately impacted. But I want to say a huge, huge thank you for coming on the podcast and talking about this incredibly interesting and important work. It's been such an interesting conversation. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it. You asked some really good questions, and I hope people now have more resources.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Wheelchair Activist. If you want to stay up to date and catch all of our previous episodes, you can find them all on my website, thewheelchairactivist.com. You can also follow me on social media at emma.vogelman on most platforms. And if you'd like to support the podcast, our links to the GoFundMe and Buy Me a Coffee are in this episode description. And I'm so excited to bring you another episode next month. See you then.